Hello everybody and welcome to Every Movie Ever. I'm your host Eric, and this is of course the show where we're reviewing every movie ever made, starting today with Menasha. So if you haven't heard of Menasha, I can't say as though I'm terribly surprised. It is a small independent film centered on New York's Hasidic Jewish community. And one of the things that sets it apart outside of this sort of unique look into a culture we don't normally get to spend a lot of time with is that the entire movie it's a foreign language movie. All the characters are speaking Hebrew. So yeah, it's a very interesting movie. It's a look at a culture that is very orthodox. I think it's fair to say that it's very conservative and sort of separated from the rest of society, and so it's a really interesting look at the day-to-day life of one man, Menasha, and he's a single father. His wife has died, and he's sort of trying to negotiate his job and his life with his son, along with pressures from his community to remarry swiftly. It is a very small and understated film. It is the first feature for Joshua Z. Weinstein, who does a really terrific job here. I'm excited to see what other movies he would like to give us. The acting is tremendous. Menasha Lustig plays the eponymous Menasha, and he's really terrific. It's a very understated performance. It feels very internal at times, which is a difficult thing to pull off on screen. Also a terrific performance from Ruben Naborsky playing Menasha's son. As a movie, it's a movie that it feels in a lot of places like a first feature. It is, like I say, a low-budget independent feature, and because of that, I do feel like it can feel a little overlong at times. Yeah, it's a movie that isn't really interested in explaining itself to the audience who might not be as familiar with the Hasidic community, which I think is both a pro and a con for the movie. I don't think the movie should have to explain itself, but because of that, you do feel, I was going to say you feel as though you're at a bit of an arm's length, but as I'm saying that, I don't feel like that's true. I feel like you do really get to intimately know Menasha here. Still, as a first feature, I'm not sure that it quite hits an enormous home run, but it's an extremely solid first effort that I'm going to give 3 stars. Up next, let's talk about When We First Met. This is a Netflix original feature starring Adam Devine in a movie that tries to sort of synthesize a romantic comedy with a big type fantasy movie, by which I mean the movie Big, and with sort of the butterfly effect, that Ashton Kutcher movie. Here's the deal. So Adam Devine meets and falls in love with Alexandra Daddario. Now, we have talked about Alexandra Daddario on this show a number of times. She's one of our favorite up-and-coming young actresses, and she's perfectly charming here. Adam meets and falls in love with her. Jump forward 3 years later, he finds himself in the dreaded friend zone as Alexandra Daddario is about to get married. What happens then is that Adam makes a big type wish, finds himself back in time 3 years earlier. He's got a chance to do it all over and make Alexandra fall in love with him, using everything he knows from being her best friend to sweep her off her feet. Jump forward 3 years into the future again. Now there are a couple, but things aren't working out the way he wanted, and so we sort of ping-pong back and forth as he keeps trying to go to the past and create the future he wants with her. the problem with this movie is that plot is kind of retrograde, right? In 2018, it is hard to root for a lead character who is attempting to manipulate the time stream to force a girl to fall in love with him, right? It's creepy. And Adam Devine ends up coming across as that guy we all know who is in love with a girl who's just not that into him and who resents her for it. Now that said, and because of that, the whole movie sort of falls short, right? It's hard to get over that hump, which makes it hard to root for Adam Devine, which sort of taints the rest of the movie. That said, the conclusion of the film, when Adam Devine realizes his mistake, sort of makes up for it. It would be easy to imagine a version of this movie that ends either in his failure or in his ultimate success, where he has finally figured out the math of both making Alexandra Daddario fall in love with him and making their future together happy. But what happens instead is he realizes that what he's doing is wrong-headed and ends up finding a romance that has been staring him in the face the whole time. That sort of makes up for everything that has gone before, but it doesn't help the entire thing feeling a little, let's say, privileged, a little unfortunate. So it's an all right movie. It's certainly watchable. It just feels like a movie that has come out in the wrong time and place, which is why I'm giving When We First Met 3 stars. All right, it's time to talk about a sci-fi movie, which means it is time to get spaced out. Today on Spaced Out, we are talking about Alien Covenant. This is the latest film in the Alien franchise. I don't want to get too far into it as the ordering of these movies has become somewhat confusing, but this is a sequel to Prometheus, which was itself a prequel to Alien. Actually all 3 films directed by Ridley Scott. After a long time away from the Alien franchise, a few years ago he came back to make the prequel Prometheus, and now he's back with the sequel to the prequel in Alien Covenant. Now, most of the characters from Prometheus are not back from Alien Covenant, as they dead. Instead, we're focusing on David, the android played by Michael Fassbender from Prometheus, who is an enormously fascinating character. He kind of got short shrift in Prometheus, but he really gets to take center stage here as a brand new group of astronauts stumble across a world that David is living on all by himself. The movie very quickly ratchets up into a sort of Island of Dr. Moreau type feature where we find out that David has not only killed the remaining survivors from Prometheus, he has killed the inhabitants of this planet and has been tinkering around with genetics to create the ultimate killing machine, meaning that David is the father of the aliens from the Alien movies. Which is sort of weird because the aliens are sort of an afterthought here. This is a movie that really is all about themes of creation and robots and humanity and can a robot be human and sort of all of these weird, heady ideas that Scott seems to have become fascinated with. It's interesting that Ridley Scott has returned to the Alien universe without being terribly interested in the aliens themselves. After all, they don't even show up in Prometheus. He is, however, very interested in David, and as a viewer, so am I. He's a fascinating character and a truly terrific villain. And there's a twist involving him at the end that, while I saw it coming, was still enormously satisfying. Really, the villain has become the protagonist of these movies, and it's also hard not to sympathize with David, who sees himself, I think rightly so, as apart from humanity and seems to have a very cruel streak running through him regarding his creators, who he feels sort of abandoned by. Fassbender also gets to play double duty in this movie, playing a second robot who shows up with the new astronauts named Walter. So we get to see some what are the differences between Walter and David sort of scenes that involve some really terrific effects of having the same actor playing dual roles on screen at the same time, including one extremely memorable scene involving a flute that I don't want to ruin for anybody because it is so peculiar. The rest of the cast is perfectly good in this movie. You have Danny McBride turning in a fine, sort of horror film role as opposed to his usual comedic stuff. Certainly makes me excited for his upcoming Halloween. You have a blink and you'll miss him appearance by James Franco. And then I'm afraid I forget the name right now of the lead actress in the feature, but she is also really good, although Ridley sort of pigeonholes her into aping Sigourney Weaver a bit too much, but that's not her fault. Alien Covenant, certainly a flawed movie, but to me a fascinating one that I am excited to revisit a number of times. 3.5 stars. Oh, it's time for an action explosion. Today on Action Explosion, it is No Escape. This is at best, peculiar film revolving around a family that has just moved to an Asian nation for a new job, and then that nation suddenly finds itself in the throes of revolution, in part because this new business that our heroes are working for has shorted the population of water, and our hero and his family need to avoid capture for the next hour and a half. The family here is very effective, and by utilizing a family at the center of this, they're able to really ratchet up the tension. There are two main problems with this movie, however. One is that it is more than a little xenophobic. It's effective, but in order to be effective, it is not afraid to really ratchet up the xenophobia, right? The other peculiar thing is that the stars of this movie are comedians, are Owen Wilson, who, while he made a few action movies in the 90s, 2000s, is primarily a comedic actor, and Lake Bell. Yeah, both gifted, skilled performers. Odd to see them in this sort of thriller. In a way, it helps to add to the humanity and the relatableness of the core family here, but still odd. They're joined by Pierce Brosnan later in the movie as sort of an action hero mercenary. He's good, but like this whole movie, like if you're gonna go this level of exploitation and xenophobia, I say go all the way. Give me Statham. Let's get Jason Statham into this thing and turn this into a massive action explosion. As it is a movie that I have enormous reservations about, but I cannot deny the watchability or effectiveness of, which is why I'm giving No Escape 3.5 stars. Now let's take a stop at the animation station. Let's talk about Ready Player One, the latest from Steven Spielberg, based on the, I don't know if controversial is the right word, but a novel with mixed reception, right? This is a big pop culture reference bonanza about a group of kids in the future who are able to enter a sort of virtual reality internet that was set up by the nerd equivalent of Willy Wonka, who has created a series of puzzles for people to figure out in order to inherit his video game company. Number one thing I want to say about this movie is it looks terrific. I chanced into seeing this movie in 3D. I do not normally go see 3D movies. I mostly find the 3D effects annoying, but this was one that I was glad to have seen in 3D. It really works well in 3D, partially because, and this is the reason why you're finding this movie at Animation Station, is so much of the movie is CG animated. All of the sequences inside of this internet feature CG created characters, and they look great on the screen and great in 3D. It's definitely a lackluster and flawed source material that relies much too heavily on nostalgia and references, but Spielberg's a gifted filmmaker, and he pulls it off more or less with that sort of ineffable Spielberg touch, adding to things. The references don't really amount to anything I could really do without them. They feel just sort of jam-packed in, and they lose a lot for me. I was excited to see the Iron Giant on the screen again, as he was featured pretty heavily in the promotional materials in this movie, and Iron Giant is a movie that I absolutely love, But, you know, since he shows up in this movie as just a reference, it's so detached from his own movie that, you know, I just didn't feel anything from him. Still, again, Spielberg is able to make a truly entertaining picture. I am reluctant to see it again because I feel like my opinion of it is going to fall sharply, both because I don't know that it's going to hold up particularly well to a second viewing, and because without that 3D spectacle buoying it, I'm just not sure how good it truly is. But based purely on my experience seeing it in the theater, I have to give Ready Player One 4 stars. Let's take a minute to look at a Hollywood classic. This week's Hollywood classic is a movie I had never even heard of. It was called Advise and Consent. This is a really solid political drama. It does fall a little bit into the trap of being a movie that is men in suits talking to each other. It's a little long, it's a little unfocused. The third act ends up going off in sort of a different direction than much of the rest of the movie that was very revolutionary for the time but feels a little stale in this day and age, but it's no less interesting. The thing that makes this movie a movie for me is the cast and the performances, because you have real home run performances from Henry Fonda as the guy who they're trying to install as a cabinet secretary. Charles Lawton playing a Southern senator who is opposed to the nomination and is pulling things out of his bag of tricks. And honestly, a really all-timer performance from Burgess Meredith. You know, he's best remembered for playing the Penguin on Batman and for playing Mickey in the Rocky movies and from his memorable episodes of The Twilight Zone. But this might be, just, you know, sort of quietly and forgotten, his greatest performance. He plays a guy who is called to the stand to sort of testify against Henry Fonda, to call Henry Fonda out for being a communist, and then whose testimony is called into question and ends up crumbling on the stand. And his performance of this man who has been thrust into the spotlight without necessarily wanting it and really isn't up to it, it's a tremendous, tremendous performance. And that alone makes this movie worth the price of admission. That said, it's not a big part of the movie. That said, we don't spend nearly enough time with Fonda and Lawton. This movie also really revels in its grayness, which can be a good thing, but ultimately I feel like lets this one down a little bit. Still, like I say, really solid drama, 3.5 stars. Now it's time for nobody's favorite part of the show. This is the worst of the week. This week's worst of the week is, why him? Which is, you know, a question you'll find yourself asking throughout the movie. And you won't find yourself asking it in the way the movie is asking it, which makes no sense, right? What the heck am I talking about? Why him? This is the movie where Bryan Cranston is a dad whose daughter has fallen in love with James Franco, which I suppose, given the things people are saying about James Franco, is already a red flag. But here James Franco plays a Silicon Valley billionaire who's into tattoos and wild parties, and dad, Bryan Cranston, just doesn't get what her daughter sees in him. But the why him you'll be asking isn't about James Franco, it's about Bryan Cranston, who is woefully miscast in this movie. He's trying to bring some of the intensity from Breaking Bad here as an upset father, but it doesn't work. In part because you don't want smoldering intensity in this movie, sort of a movie. You want more of an 80s era bumbling mistrust that a Chevy Chase can give you. Or at the worst, a Father of the Bride era Steve Martin might be able to give you. But the sort of, you know, the Heisenberg level, you know, threat of Bryan Cranston just does not work in what is otherwise a wacky comedy movie. Megan Mullally plays the mom here. She's really gets to do some really wonderful stuff. It's fun to see her in this movie. Keegan-Michael Key gets to play the sort of, if we're talking Father of the Bride, he gets to play the Frank of this movie as the wacky assistant to James Franco. He's really fun. Franco himself is a bit much, but, you know, Cranston makes it difficult to side with him in this movie, so you're never really sure whose side you're on. Ultimately, I guess I'm on Megan Mullally's side because she's the best part of it. Why him? 2 stars. All right, now let's forget about all of that and let's talk about Best of the Bunch. This week's Best of the Bunch, implausibly, is Overboard. Now listen, folks, I had never seen Overboard before. I guess I've sort of avoided it. It looks pretty stupid. But at the end of the day, I am a huge fan of our leads, and our leads are the inestimable Goldie Hawn, turning in probably her finest movie performance, and the always charming Kurt Russell. That these two are a real-life couple makes my heart happy. They are both charming as hell, and they have their charm turned up to 11 in this feature. The storyline of the movie is this: Goldie Hawn is a rich woman who is, for the sake of family viewing here, let's call her Snotty. And she has hired Kurt Russell to install he's a handyman, a blue-collar handyman. She hires him to install a closet on her yacht. They fight. She gets in an argument with her husband, played by the dad from Gilmore Girls. She gets in an argument with him, falls off the yacht, gets amnesia. Kurt Russell somehow finds her and decides to get his revenge on her for all the fights on the yacht, and also for her firing him and not paying him. He's going to trick her into thinking she is his wife and get her to do housework for him in order to pay off the debt he feels she owes him. It's a plot that feels like it should have come out of the 40s, being told in the 80s, and watching it in 2018, it rightly feels creepy as heck. Because there's no way to watch this movie that Kurt Russell isn't taking advantage of Goldie Hawn and being an enormous creep. But here's the thing. The picture is directed by Gary Marshall of Happy Days fame, right? And Gary Marshall, who also directed Pretty Woman, which itself is a movie that has a premise that is on its surface enormously creepy, but is nonetheless a beloved 80s feature film, does it again here. Only Gary Marshall could get away with this sort of premise that is so on its face creepy. But Marshall somehow knows how to just so deftly approach the line of propriety here. By making Kurt Russell conflicted, and by making him never take things too far with Hawn, it's easier to swallow what's happening and to watch an actual romance between them blossom. The other key element of this feature is the kids. Kurt Russell has these 3 rowdy kids, 3 or 4, I don't remember. He's got these super rowdy kids, a couple of boys and a girl, and as soon as Hawn comes in as their mom, they initially want to like prank the heck out of her, but then they fall in love with her, and she falls in love with them in an element of the movie that is more important, I think, than the romance between her and Russell. And thank God they have the chemistry that they do, because that really helps this picture. But her chemistry with the kids is an enormous saving grace of this picture and makes the whole bitter pill of the plot so much easier to swallow. So that when we get to the inevitable third act, when she realizes that Russell has been tricking her and she runs away, the loss that she and the children feel and that we as an audience feel really makes the whole thing, it's the final piece of the puzzle that makes the whole thing click. Overboard is going into it, if you had told me it would be my best of the bunch this week, I would have told you were wrong. But man, it is hard not to like these actors and this movie in spite of anything, which is why I've got to give Overboard 4 stars. So that is going to do it for this week's Every Movie Ever. Thank you so much for watching. We'll be back next week as we keep trying to review every movie ever made. And don't forget to visit our website, northmetrotv.com/everymovieever. There, you can watch reviews of every movie we've ever covered here on the show, as well as complete episodes. That's northmetrotv.com/everymovieever.